Hello and welcome to All the Things. This is a show where we discuss all the things related to God, the Bible, and real life. I'm Krista Bontrager. Glad to be here with you. I'm also known as Theology Mom, and this is a show where we love discussing the cultural issues of the day in light of the Christian worldview. We are live. Unfortunately, my normal conversation partner, Monique Dusan, is not here with me. She's celebrating her mother's 70th birthday. Give a shout out to Miss Pauline. She survived raising 4 kids in the hood, and they're all celebrating her and all her grandkids tonight. And they're having a good time. Monique got a big cake and balloons and everything. So they're having a good time. So we got Kevin Briggins here. Hey, Briggins, what's up?
Hey, glad to be here. It seems like this is kind of becoming a regular thing,
I know.
me and you.
Now, you shrunk a little bit while we were off screen. So now you got a lot of headroom. You want to, so now I'm feeling like really big. There we go. Now we're about the same size.
All right.
All right. Well, I'm glad that you're here. We are live. Shout out to our moderators, Elaine, Allison, and Laura. They're like watching the playoffs for baseball and doing other stuff. So I don't know. But the Angels didn't make it to the playoffs. So we're here. And I know that your team lost today, Kevin. Are you surviving?
No, because my phone is still blowing up. For those that don't know, I'm a big Alabama fan. And yeah, they lost to Vandy today. And all I put on Facebook was the Lord works in mysterious ways, because that's all I could say.
Oh, well, I'm sorry. Sorry for your loss there.
Thank you.
So we do want to let everyone know to make sure you are subscribed to receive our weekly updates. That way you'll know when we have a show, when we're going to be live, what the topic is. We send those out on Friday. Just go to allthethingshow.com. and you can get that little newsletter. We won't spam you. You're just going to get one newsletter on Friday just to alert you as to what the show is for the weekend. And just once again, just so everybody knows, like we try to do 2 live shows a month and 1 pre-recorded show. And then we try to have 1 Saturday off so that, we can have a day off every once in a while. So you can go check that out at allthethingshow.com. All right, Kevin, tonight we're talking about cultural renewal, and we have an awesome guest to help us with that project. Now, earlier this season, Monique and I did an entire episode on the whole term of human flourishing, which is just out there in the public discourse. And we did an entire episode of trying to look at scripture, what scripture has to say about a lot of these very foundational topics. Kind of looking at tonight's conversation as being a follow-up to that. We're going to look at a lot of practicals with our friend Delano Squires, doing a deep dive into some of the causes of our cultural collapse, particularly in the Black culture, and a pathway out of some of this mess. Tell us, I want to hear from you, like, first, how did you encounter Delano's work? And then we'll bring him on. And but just talk about, like, I know you've had him on Off Code before. Like, What do you find interesting about his work?
Man, a lot. So if you guys aren't following Delano on Twitter, you are missing out, because he posts a lot of good stuff and a lot of good content and his thoughts. And one thing I appreciate about his work at the Heritage Foundation, which we're going to talk about, is just his heavy focus on the family and his heavy focus on really what are the things that truly drive change and success and the patterns of success. And it's usually, it's family formation. And so he focuses a lot on that. And he does a very good job of kind of pointing out the inconsistencies of a lot of the people I'm trying to think of the right way to put it, in the, I don't say liberal progressive space, or the, as Delano like to say, the black Afrostocracy, you know. And so he does a really good job of challenging them and pointing out their inconsistencies and the flaws in their arguments and the hypocrisy of some of their arguments.
Yeah, I think that's a really great way of saying it. And if people are on Twitter, definitely Delano is one in my top 5 follows that I do, and he's definitely worth it. Thoughtful, careful, engaging, just really great work. So I'm super glad to get him on the show. I've been wanting him to come on all the things for about 3 or 4 years. So this has been, I'm super excited for this conversation, and I'm glad for his, just his perspective, and to be able to introduce him tonight to our followers here. So let's get him on. Mr. Delano Squires from the Heritage Foundation. Welcome, Delano.
Thank you for having me.
It's great to have you here. And I know that Monique is very upset that she's not here. But the date that you chose was the one for her mother's birthday party. So she yeah. So we got Kevin here. But give us a short kind of introduction of yourself. You're going to be new, I think, to a lot of people on the stream. And what, tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, but also what got you interested in commenting on public issues and politics?
Sure. So I'm currently a research fellow at the Heritage Foundation. I'm in the Center for Life, Religion, and Family. So a lot of my research focuses on marriage, on family formation, on fatherhood. Prior to that, I worked 15 years in DC government and local government in a series of sort of public-facing positions, always in the community, including running a digital divide program where we provided tech access to low-income residents, to ex-offenders, to K through 12 students, to senior citizens. And then my last year in city government was with the Office of Gun Violence Prevention. So I've had a, not a straight line path in terms of my career trajectory. But I've always been interested in these issues, particularly around family, marriage, and family structure. And actually got my start writing publicly with a website called Black and Married with Kids. This was over 10 years ago. And from there, I've written for a number of publications. I've written for The Root and The Griot, which certainly would be considered on the left today. They weren't as left-leaning when I wrote for them, but still at least center-left. So I've written for The Root and The Griot, and I've written for The Federalist, and now I have a weekly column with The Blaze. So that's me, sort of, short version. I'm interested in many things. I listen to many different people, and just try to keep my mind open and to be curious. And I think that helps me with my sort of political analysis and social commentary.
Yeah, and you do that so well. And I think it's interesting that you used to write for, I think it's called The Root, or
Yeah.
And I remember when we first met you, we were all at a conference together back east, and I remember you mentioning that you had even gone to their recent conference, and you were really emphasizing, I thought, a very thoughtful point that of the importance of interacting with other voices and trying to go into more progressive spaces, but to be a stand for, a more traditional position, but still engaging with people and being able to have those discussions. I just thought that was such a thoughtful approach, and it really made me think about the importance of that.
Yeah, I mean, some of those websites have changed so much over the years. Just a fun fact: when I wrote for The Griot, this is probably 2012, and there wasn't many pieces. I probably wrote 2 pieces. My editor at the time was Joanne Reed. So that should just tell you how long ago that was. And the site, both sites, I think, have sort of drifted to the left. But I'm a big believer in engagement. I'm not I naturally, I like discussion. Some people will say, I like to debate. Okay, I'm fine with that. But I'm the type of person I would love to spend most of my time speaking with people who don't agree with me. That's just so when I write things, even today from the Heritage Foundation, I'm always pitching center left publications because I'm hoping to be able to sway a few people and convince a few people to see some of these issues, particularly the most contentious issues, in a slightly different light. So I welcome the opportunity to go to the Root, to their conference at Howard University. It wasn't as well attended as I hoped, but I was able to ask a few questions and engage a few people who didn't particularly want to engage me. But that's fine. I don't take it personally.
Yeah, that's such a great strategy, I think. I know a lot of your work involves commenting on what's happening in the culture. Sometimes that's cultural degradation, just making observations about that. Sometimes you're commenting about pathways to renewal. I know you have a chapter in the new book edited by our friend Katie Faust called ProChild Politics. Tell us a little bit about kind of the big idea of this book and what your chapter was about.
So the big idea of the book is that children should be the focal point of our public policy, particularly, social and domestic policy. Anyone who follows Katie knows that this is her issue, right? She always brings particular issues of the family back to the needs of the child. And I think with this book, she expanded out into other territories. So my chapter was on race. There were chapters on immigration, certainly on family and marriage. But all of it was to center children and to make a call for, a more robust pro-child sort of policy platform. I think the big idea of my chapter, the one on race, is that, and this was a similar format to a lot of the chapters, right? Whereas, you talk about the lies people tell about a particular topic, the truth of that topic, how the lies hurt children, and how the truth helps children. So when I talked about race, I talked about the lie of racial essentialism. I talked about the lie of good discrimination. So I referenced Ibram Kendi a few times, and Robin DiAngelo. And I talked about how the way we talk about race today hurts children. I think the way we talk about race and our obsession with race, I think, is bad for the mind and also bad for the soul. So I had a good time writing it. I got to mention issues that I pulled from the news, that highlighted how race has been distorted and weaponized and used against us as Americans, and even specifically against Black Americans. And then I also got to talk about how we move forward and framing the alternative in sort of a biblical framework in terms of talking about the importance of every child's life being because of the inherent value that they have because they're made in God's image, not because of their skin color.
So in the chapter, I thought it was really good. And you mentioned how race essentialism and some other things are harmful to children. Kind of detail a little bit how, in what ways are these things harmful to children?
Well, I think part of it is that there's a couple of different things. One, I in the chapter I reference Dr. Kenneth and Mamie Clark, who they are famous for doing the doll test. This is from like the 1940s and 50s, that showed that even at a young age, Black children had developed a negative self-image because of the imagery that they were, I think, saturated with because of, legalized segregation. You can imagine, the types of effects it would have on a child to constantly be reminded that because of their skin color, they are in an inferior or second-class position in our society. And I think that type of thing still holds true today. So it's both the obsession around race, but it's also the specific messages kids get. And some of those messages, I think certainly people would say are still anti-black, so to speak. But some of them are quite frankly anti-white. So if you listen to someone, you know, Robin DiAngelo, who engages, and I wrote this in the book, in racial pseudoscience in the same way that Samuel Cartwright, a physician from the 1800s who coined the term drapetomania, which described the tendency for enslaved Africans wanting to run away and escape slavery. He thought that that was a mental condition. I think when you have people engaging in racial pseudoscience, spreading it throughout the culture, and even pushing it down to the level of K through 12 education, so that a white child will look at themselves and say, I'm an oppressor. And a black child will look at, a black boy will look at himself and say, I'm oppressed. Before they do anything, before they exhibit any sort of character traits, they have adults pushing onto them the notion that the color of their skin determines not just who they are, but where they will ultimately end up in society.
I'm glad that you brought up in the issue of the self-perception of white children. We do get a fair amount of letters at the ministry from parents that their children are struggling with, from white parents, that their children are struggling with self-perception and self-loathing and being called pretty horrible names. When we do discussions with teenagers, when Monique and I are on the road, one of the exercises we do is to have students in the room make a list of the names that they have been called. And that can be from social media, the news media, their friends. And I'll never forget one young white student, he probably 18, and he said, the worst name I've been called is a white colonizing POS, because my parents are involved in foster care and caring for children in the foster care system. And then we are looked at in a very negative way. And you could just tell like the emotion that came over him from people calling him these names. It does have an impact, and we are seeing this more in our correspondence at the ministry. So I'm glad to hear that you brought that up, and because it's real not PC to talk about that, because I think there's a thought out there that white people just aren't supposed to be impacted or affected by those sorts of things.
Yeah, I agree in terms of that's the thought. I think that thought is ridiculous, because people, regardless of their ethnic background, are human beings, right? And we all sort of abide by the laws of humanity. And if any people group feels that they are being put upon and beat up and pushed down, now some number of them may take that for a certain amount of time, and then another subset are going to say, no, I'm not going to take this anymore. And one of the reasons that I think mentioning people like Robin DiAngelo is important is because when you sow Robin DiAngelo for long enough in the culture, at some point you are going to reap a Richard Spencer, or even maybe worse, a David Duke, right? Where people say, oh, okay, so you want to activate a racial identity in the white majority? Okay, sure, we can play that game. And the people on the left who activate it and say, now that you feel raced, so to speak, in the same way that, quote unquote, black and brown people do, here is what you should do with that feeling. You should apologize for your white privilege. You should use your privilege and power to advance the interests of oppressed minorities. And that's how the left sort of deals with the activation of white racial identity. But there are going to be people, and I guess if I'm using a binary, they would more so be on the right, who say, no, they reach out to that young white man, that disaffected and disconnected white man, and say, no, you should be proud to be white. That's how God made you. And I'm going to show you how to live as an unapologetic white man. And that's not just, kitschy things like, white boy summer t-shirts. So some of that can get very dark. No pun intended. So one of my frustrations again with people like, D'Angelo, like Kendi, is I see clearly how their work is going to play out. And I think there's actually a parallel to all of the conversations that we have around oppressed and oppressor groups, where the people who are constantly told that they are oppressors, there's going to be a backlash against that. It's easiest to see in terms of the white-black binary. It's we're going to see something similar in terms of the gay-straight binary. We're going to see something similar in terms of the quote-unquote cisgender, transgender binary. Again, no pun intended. Where eventually people are going to say, no, I'm done pretending that some 6'6", 240 guy with a huge Adam's apple, bulging biceps is fully intact is a woman just because he says that he is. And I think we as a society should be mindful of the things that we're sowing into the culture, because eventually we're going to reap them. And one of the reasons, and this is for me, very important for me to acknowledge from time to time, is that I believe, and I say this particularly as a Christian, one of the things in shortest supply in public commentary, even from many Christians, are honest weights and just scales. And I've seen how you may have, a self-professed evangelical who would react in horror if someone made generalizing, stereotyping comments about Black people, but have no issue doing it or co-signing it or promoting it or defending it when it's about white people. And I'll give you a quick example, because I'm a big believer in naming names. I don't like to do sort of guesswork. So there was a few years ago, and I believe the conference was called the Sparrow Conference, which was a women's conference. And you all might know the story. There was a guest named Ekemini Uwan. I hope I'm pronouncing her name correctly. And the crowd, which I gather was majority white, Miss Uwan, who's a black woman, I believe a Nigerian woman, was talking to them about whiteness. Now she is, self-professed public theologian, and a podcaster, and she talked to them about whiteness and how they have to repent of whiteness, and whiteness is rooted in plunder and theft and murder and so on and so on and so forth. And whiteness has to be redeemed. I'm paraphrasing, but I think I'm fairly on the path. And I just thought to myself, I couldn't imagine a reaction if a white public theologian said, "Well, Blackness is rooted in violent crime and broken homes and whatever other things you want to throw in there." But for some reason, one of those things can be accepted and promoted, even again in some Christian circles, and one of those things would be seen as a first order violation of the rules of race. And I don't abide by that. So, I'm an equal weights and equal measures type of guy. So, and I also have thick skin. So when I see people engaging in, online shenanigans, it doesn't bother me, because the only thing I say is, okay, as long as you are ready to take what it is that you dish out, then we're all good. But one of the things that I've realized over the years, and I'm sure you all see this, is that very few people are built that way. And there are a lot of cry bullies in the church, outside the church, in public commentary, in the media, in sports, in politics, on both sides of the aisle. And I just, resolve it in myself to not be that type of person. So
that's really good. It's just a little fun fact. That video that you're talking about of the Sparrow Conference in Ekemini Uwan was one of the very first videos that Monique and I did a public reaction video to. And maybe our moderators who are clever can find it back on the Theology Mom channel. But it was in 2019, and Monique was still pretty deep in critical race theory at that time. And we watched the video together, did a reaction video. And that was, you know, one of the turning points for her, of hearing it in real time and then having to comment on it. So, yeah, people can see if they want to go back in the Wayback Machine, and see that little conversation. But I think that your work on the African American community, I would love to talk a little bit more about that, because one of the things I've learned from both you and Kevin is having a more historical perspective on what the African American culture was about and the values of that community, and that historically it's been much more aligned with the Christian worldview, but has been co-opted in recent decades. And I guess I would love for you to kind of give us a little bit of a historical perspective on what the African American community and what those values have historically been that made the descendants of slaves into such a strong and resilient community.
I think sort of the bedrock foundation of that was the church, right? It was the Christian scriptures, and I think that deep and abiding belief in God, which for many African Americans came oftentimes at the end of the whip, right? However it came to them, it stuck. And I mean, there were black churches being formed even before slavery ended. And one of the things that you saw is that faith, and even if it wasn't every single person, it was a day and age where there was both private virtue and public morality that was grounded in a biblical and Christian worldview. And I see this. There's a book that I purchased probably last year called 20th Century Negro Literature. It's a compilation of essays that was published in 1902 by a man named Daniel Wallace Culp. And in that book, there may be 40 different topics, right? One is, should the colleges of the South be put into the hands of Negro teachers? Or another is, what role should the educated Black woman play in the uplift of the Negro? That type of thing. So actually, many of the issues that we talk about now, but discussed by people with far more expansive vocabularies, far more sophisticated worldviews. And you can tell that these individuals were appealing to something far greater than just, anti-racism pseudoscience. So, and you see this in the writing of Booker T. Washington, you see it in the writing of Frederick Douglass, that, there was an appeal to a higher authority. And that Christian faith, I think, guided the Black community through some of the darkest days in this country's history. I think that changed sometime in the 60s. And I know, a person like Dr. King, not a person like Dr. Martin Luther King, is falling out of favor with some evangelicals or some conservatives. And I don't believe any public figure is above criticism. But the civil rights movement in the 1960s, I would say, was still, appealing again to biblical values. I would argue that the person who really helped steer the train off course is James Cone, the father of liberation theology, because I think once that hit, many Black preachers and Black churches made a devil's bargain and traded biblical fidelity for the pursuit of social justice. And ever since the mid 60s and 70s, when, Dr. King and his cohort they were rejected as radicals, who wanted to sort of upset the status quo. And my contention, and this is a sort of a universal principle, is that the rejection of moderation is what leads to radicalism. So when the King generation is sort of declines, then you get more radical groups, the Black Panthers, at the same time. So you have revolutionary politics coming in that is disconnected from a biblical framework, that's oftentimes Marxist in nature. At the same time, when the church, which should have been a steadying force, also is taking on a similar position. So it's radicalism and quote unquote revolution, both inside and outside the church. And I think that's one of the things that has gotten us off track, because since then, you have seen many Black churches, not all, but a significant number, certainly some of the most prominent and preachers with some of the biggest public profiles, basically parrot every single leftist progressive talking point. And they use the scripture to justify abortion, same-sex marriage, now transgenderism. So anything that is on the sort of progressive left, anything that can be framed as a fight for liberation and fight for the marginalized and fight for the oppressed, you will have preachers, your Otis Mosses, your Jamal Bryants, your Freddie Hayneses, who will say, no, this is where the Black church needs to be. And I think that is one of the reasons that the Black church has lost a lot of its, not just social standing, but its spiritual power.
Man, that is spot on. I couldn't have said it any better. Yeah, those two kind of things you mentioned, the civil rights movement, and at the same time, James Cone's liberation theology in 1965, I mean, those things had a profound effect. And the thing is that the Black church is what the Black community was built on. So you can effectively change the messaging of the church. You effectively change the community. And that's clearly what we saw. At the same time, you've got revolution was just in the air. You got the sexual revolution. You got, you got the feminist movement. You got all of these liberation movements all saying the same things. And it's almost like the Black church couldn't differentiate between what was a truly kind of biblical perspective to have and what was this kind of cultural Marxist movement of oppressor oppressed revolution liberation stuff. And so you saw the Black church really kind of adopt a lot of this. And I mean, even today there are only a handful of Black churches that I would even attend, because that what we call the social gospel liberation theology is so prominent. And then if it's not that, then it's the word of faith theology,
Right.
Yeah. And so it's like, man, your options are really slim, but we know there are some of those churches out there. In your chapter, you mentioned because you one thing I appreciate about your work is you always give solutions, right? And in your chapter, you talked about like the success sequence, right? You talked about family formation. Why is it that kind of, the leaders of the Black community, why don't they speak out more on these things? Why aren't these things more talked about and advocated for? Because we know the data shows that these things make a difference.
Before Delano answers that question, I'm going to go to a quick break. I'm going to leave it as on a cliffhanger. That's a great question. Kevin is like, all right, we've identified some problems here. Here's some solutions, but it doesn't seem like people are getting behind those solutions. So we'll be right back. We're going to hear from our friends at Impact 360. And when we come back, we'll hear Delano's answer.
It's time to prepare. Let's get ready for the journey ahead. Life doesn't give us a redo. We don't get to run it back. Along the way, we will face obstacles and challenges, but we are carrying light into the dark places. Our paths and our destinations are different, but our beginning is the same. We must prepare. This is why Impact 360 Institute exists. Get ready to grow, to stand firm, to be who God created you to be, to lead with courage, truth, and love. This experience will transform your life. Be challenged to grow your faith. Learn how to think, not what to think. Build community with those seeking to live like Jesus. Establish spiritual rhythms, discover how to be and make disciples. And put your faith into action. As you prepare for the journey ahead, deepen your understanding of what God has revealed about reality and why Christianity is true. Discover your identity in Christ and your God-given calling in authentic community. Cultivate a servant's heart and live a life of spirit-empowered kingdom influence.
And once again, we want to encourage you to go check out the work of our friends at Impact 360 and many of their programs to see if it might be a helpful resource for your family and the discipleship of your kids. All right, Delano. So before we went to the break, Kevin is saying, like, talk about this success sequence, maybe explain what that is and why you think it's not, just kind of being more accepted as a pathway to cultural renewal. Oh, you muted yourself. It's okay.
Cool. Thank you.
Yeah.
The success sequence refers to research that shows that millennials who finish high school, secure full-time employment, marry, and then have children in that order. So education, employment, marriage, and children have a single-digit poverty rate by the time they hit their mid-30s. This is research that has been done with Brookings Institute, AEI, Brad Wilcox, who is a sociology professor at University of Virginia, has done a lot of work on the success sequence, and these outcomes hold regardless of where a person starts in terms of their own socioeconomic status, their family socioeconomic status, and regardless of race. So it's one of those things where it is a message that is easy to understand with steps that are within any person's reach, and it's something that some schools, and I know Ian Rowe, who runs schools in the South Bronx, and is also a senior fellow at AEI, has started to incorporate the success sequence descriptively in the classroom. So just telling kids, hey, there are a series of steps that you can take that will make it almost impossible for you to end up in poverty. And it's something that a lot of conservatives have become more vocal about discussing in recent years. Now, to Kevin's question in terms of why a lot of Black leaders don't talk about either the success sequence or family, marriage, and the connection between those things and social outcomes, I think the answer is fairly straightforward. The progressive left, and Kevin mentioned the Afrostocracy, right? It's what I call the Black progressive politicians, pundits, preachers, professors, and performers. So those 5 Ps. When they speak about the issues facing the Black community, all of them boil down to income inequality or structural inequality and systemic racism. And this is why the only solutions that they're interested in are ones related to bigger government or better white people. And how African Americans form families cannot be pigeonholed in either of those categories. So anything that would require agency, personal responsibility on our part, on the part of the Black community, they have no interest in. I mean, Ibram Kendi has said that the term personal responsibility is functionally racist. So the family is not something that they would touch. And the last prominent liberal, Black liberal, progressive that I can think of who consistently linked marriage and family structure to social outcomes was President Barack Obama. He did it when he was a candidate, and was chastised by Jesse Jackson when he gave a Father's Day speech in Chicago in 2008. He did it while he was in office. When he gave the commencement at Morehouse, he talked about marriage and family to the young men who were graduating. He did it in several speeches, to the point where one radical feminist professor named Brittany Cooper chastised him in an op-ed in Ebony magazine in 2013, when he went to the South Side of Chicago and talked about the thing that would be most effective in bringing down violent crime in these neighborhoods would be intact families. And he said, this is why we need to promote marriage and fatherhood and so on and so forth. So since then, I can't think of any national, any sort of Black progressive with a national profile who does that. And it's a shame, because, as you said, Kevin, you know, the church was one of those foundational institutions that helped the Black community not just survive but thrive, and the other is the family. And both of those things started to decline, you know, in the 60s, and certainly you see those declines even more prominent now, which is why I'm actually writing a book. My manuscript is due in a month, on restoring marriage as the foundation of Black family life, and I start with my first chapter is on slavery, and I talk about the role that played in deforming the family, distorting it, but it didn't destroy it. And I go on to talk about the six. I call these the Sinister Six, the six groups that actually did sort of break apart that family structure. I call it traditional. It's really a biblical family structure. I talked about the paternalists, who believe in big government, who believe that Uncle Sam is a suitable father for millions of women and their children. I talked about feminists, who tell women that femininity is weak, masculinity is toxic, marriage is a tool of oppression, the home is a prison, and children are a burden. I talk about LGBT activists who change the very definitions, both in cultural understanding, and public policy, of man, woman, and marriage. I talk about anti-racists who believe that every issue facing the Black community must be solved by white people. So this is one of the reasons that they're not interested in touching the issue of marriage. I talk about functional atheists. So again, we referencing back to the conversation we just had about, you know, many of the folks in the Black church who identify as Christians, but who've ceded all their moral authority because they would rather chase social justice. And then the last group are the abortionists, who want to destroy the child and see abortion as a tool of liberation. And many, particularly Black feminists, have joined them in that pursuit. So the group of the Sinister Six, did far more to destroy the traditional Black family than slavery did. And the reason, and I'll shut up here, slavery was a hostile institution to the family. The institution of slavery and the institution of family are completely irreconcilable and incompatible. Marriage presupposes sexual exclusivity. It presupposes monogamy, cohabitation, male protection. None of those things were possible in American chattel slavery. But, and Kevin, I know Kevin knows this, a man's natural inclination when faced with an enemy is to fight. But the six forces that I named, paternalism, feminism, abortionism, if I could use that term, anti-racism, functional atheism, and LGBT activism, each one of those entities came to the Black community as a friend and an ally, quote unquote. And when a friend shows up at your front door, you open it and you welcome them in. And that's why each one of those groups has had the things that they've been pushing either implemented in sort of our social norms and our public culture, or actually inscribed in our laws and public policy. So that's the big difference, and why they were so much more effective at destroying the Black family and undermining it than the slave master was.
That's super helpful. And I'm excited about your book and that it's going to be coming out. I think what you're hitting on there is the importance of identifying the correct problems and solutions. And, if you identify the incorrect problems, then you're going to not implement the correct solutions that will actually be helpful to people. God's plan for human flourishing, a big component of that is the family, the nuclear family, and, as you said, the male protective instinct. And there's just so many things to undermine these very biblical ideas of sex and gender and the role of the government and all of these things. The Bible speaks to these issues, but not all, and I think this is important, and this is a point that Monique and I are always making. It's not helpful just to say, well, what BIPOC voices should I follow? The real question is who's identifying the biblical problems and solutions? Because not all Black commentators agree with your position. They don't all agree that these are the problems and these are the solutions. As you said earlier, when the Black church kind of adopted and made liberation theology and social justice kind of a core value, that had ripple effects in other areas. And so I think we have to understand and make careful differentiations on these issues. I don't know if you want to comment on that or if you have any thoughts or pushback or anything. I would certainly welcome that.
I mean, I'm always about, making careful, thoughtful analysis. And actually, one of the things I love the sort of the metaphor you use in terms of diagnosis, right? Treatment, prognosis. I talk about that in the chapter in my book that I wrote, critical of the Black leadership class, and I actually call it the Tuskegee Effect. Excuse me, because a lot of people think about the Tuskegee experiment, and in the popular imagination, I think many people think the Tuskegee experiment was about the government prescribing or pushing bad medicine on poor Black men. And that's actually not what happened. And I only say that that's in the popular sentiment because it came up during COVID. People said, oh, this is a lot of Black folks are skeptical of the vaccine because of the Tuskegee experiment. Well, the Tuskegee experiment was about the government withholding medical treatment, right? And I think in the same respect, there's some sort of social and political commentators who just don't talk about certain issues. And they allow these issues to metastasize. And what I say is that a good cultural physician will observe symptoms, make a diagnosis, recommend a treatment, and be able to distinguish between, the actual, the type of issue that they're dealing with. Some issues are chronic. Some issues are chronic just because, the human race is fallen. But instead, I think what we get oftentimes, especially in the Black community on issues of race, we have spin doctors who think that the worst thing for the Black community is bad press and bad publicity. So they won't even touch certain issues because they'll say, well, we don't want to speak about inner city crime because we don't want to perpetuate certain negative stereotypes, and we don't want to give white racists more ammunition. And my response is, okay, so would you rather not talk about an issue and allow another generation of young men to die in the streets because some white person in Iowa may think something negative about a person in Philadelphia? I mean, you could do that, but I don't think it's helpful. So you have your spin doctors who are all about PR, and then you have your witch doctors who recommend self-destructive ideas to the Black community, knowing full well that these things will not benefit us. One example is I mentioned Brittany Cooper, who again is a radical, self-professed radical feminist who teaches, I believe, at Rutgers University. And one time we were, dialoguing online, and she said, the Black community does not need nuclear families to thrive. I said, oh, that's quite a statement, right? It's that type of thing. Or a professor of pharmacology and psychology at Columbia University named Carl Hart, who wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post a few years ago. And I'm paraphrasing the title, but it said, "I'd rather my children do drugs or interact with drugs than interact with the police." These are the type of ridiculous ideas that you get sometimes. So there are a lot of people who complain about problems, but don't have the slightest clue about how to diagnose them. And I think, and I'll say this, I think a big part of that is because they don't have a biblical worldview, so they don't understand human nature in many respects. And I think this hampers their analysis. One example, this person's not even Black, certainly well known and respected in social science circles. But as I was doing research for the book, there was a chapter in the Moynihan report where Daniel Patrick Moynihan said something to the effect of, when he talked about the matriarchal nature of the Black family, he said, well, there's no specific reason why families should be led by men and fathers, but if one group, a minority community in a majority culture where father-led households are the norm and they have mother-led households, then they are going to lose out. And I said, for all of his social science chops, that is a glaring hole in his worldview. And because he went on to, he was thinking that the reason that the matriarchal family structure was a problem is because it was out of step of what white people were doing, which is some of the same things you hear from, the BLM types, disrupting the Western prescribed nuclear family. That notion that the nuclear family is somehow upholding Western white supremacy, cis heteropatriarchy, all the nonsense terms. But I said, this is what happens when you're disconnected from the scriptures, because you think that marriage is the white man's invention as opposed to God's invention. So I'm not surprised when these people come up with bad treatment plans, because they don't know the balm in Gilead, right? They don't know the true healer. So I'm not surprised by it.
Man, I think we could talk another hour, because when you were talking about your six things, like what came to me was all of those things are nothing but attacks on men and male headship and the role of men in the family and the household. And yeah, it's just like you say, masculinity is toxic, masculinity is bad. And you also talked about earlier where eventually people push back on these things, right? And I think we're seeing that in the culture of young men starting to really push back on a lot of this stuff, right? So I think we can have a whole another conversation on just that. But in terms of cultural renewal, because I know we got to wrap up, what role do you think we as Christians should play in this? I know there's a lot of different ways and roles in which this could go, but in your mind, in terms of cultural renewal, what role do you think that we as Christians can play?
I think we have a tremendous responsibility and obligation. So many of the issues that we're facing now are sort of first order definitional issues, right? What is a man? What is a woman? If you can't answer those things, how can you even get to what is a family? What is a marriage? And I think Christians specifically have a role to play. And I think pastors, right, who believe the Bible and preach the gospel, are going to be more important today probably than ever before, because the world is devolving at such a rapid pace that somebody needs to shine a light into this darkness. So I do think Christians have a tremendous role to play. The question is, for many of them, is whether they accept that responsibility, because I think, particularly in churches that are not especially holding, practicing good doctrine, and even some that are. I'm thinking of J.D. Greear, who was formerly president of the Southern Baptist Convention, when he said during a podcast, and I think he later walked this back, but that he would practice pronoun hospitality, quote unquote, with a man who thinks that he's a woman just on his own say so. That is a terrible idea to put out to fellow believers, because what we need more than ever today, I think, is courage, and just the courage to say what God has said on many of these issues. So, yeah, I think Christians have a tremendous role to play, and not just because of the insanity of the left. I think a post-Christian conservatism is going to be way uglier than most people realize, because it will come waving the banner, right? It'll be plastered with Christ is King stickers, and be expressed by people who are willing to say that because they're based, quote unquote, but really don't believe that Jesus is Lord. So I think, we need good preaching, good teaching now more than ever.
That's really good. I'm going to do a quick comment on Facebook and see if you have anything to add to this, Delano. Someone's asking, have you done any study on the cultures in Africa and how those original cultures have fared over time in reference to the family in juxtaposition with American Black culture?
That's a good question. I haven't actually. And I think one of the reasons is that Africa is a huge continent with hundreds, if not thousands, of tribes and languages, distinct cultures. So I think it might be hard to make and pinpoint, a good sort of comparison. But I know one thing, and I got this from watching Matt Walsh's "Am I a Woman" documentary, is that the Maasai, right, a tribe in Kenya, they still know what a woman is. So I mean, at the very least, they have that on us. And the other thing that's interesting when you bring up African culture and some of these issues around biblical sexual ethics, is that I find it odd that the people who are most critical of 19th century colonization have no problem with the United States exporting our values and our oftentimes perverse and degenerate values, and trying to push them on African nations who want to exercise both national sovereignty and also say, well, in this country, we outlaw certain types of sexual behavior and we penalize you, we punish you for it. All right. Now in America, if in San Francisco, you can dance naked in the street in front of children as long as it's June and it's a city approved pride parade, but you can't do that in Uganda. You can't do that in Kenya. You can't do that in Ethiopia. And there are people, particularly on the left, who have no problem with exporting our values and engaging in cultural imperialism over on the continent. I just find that ironic. So.
Yeah, we talked about that a couple of weeks ago on the show. Monique had just gotten back from a month-long trip teaching tour in Africa, in South Africa and Uganda, and made that point very strongly that we call it the new colonialism of exporting our ideology, pro-abortion, transgender, confusion, homosexuality, and that all of those things are being imported into Africa largely through UNESCO and the United Nations. And I would say if Monique was here, she would say that those nations and areas in Africa that haven't yet heard of this ideology, and they are still operating in many places in the traditional family. She still says it's very strong in Africa, even among the most poor, that she's worked with very impoverished communities in South Africa and the Cape Flats, where she was a missionary 4.5 years. The traditional family is still very strong and the core of their society. And even though they struggle with violence and gangs in the colored community, in the Black community, it's what we call the traditional family is still, it is a major stabilizing force in the middle of all of that chaos. So people can go back and check our conversation about some of those issues that we had a couple of weeks ago on the show when Monique came back from her mission trip. But it's just it is a great question. So thank you so much, Delano, for being here and having this conversation with us. It's great to finally get you on the show, and we look forward to more engagement. Please consider sending us a copy of your book for possible endorsement. We would love to take a look at it when you get ready for that.
Yeah. Lord willing, it'll be out next year. Title still has not been decided. The last one I sent to the publisher was Black Wives Matter: Why Black Men Must Lead in Rebuilding the Family Structure Liberals Destroyed. So that should tell you, give you a sense of where the direction that I'm going. I'm not sure if we'll end up there, but that's where I'm going with it. But yeah, I definitely would love to send you all a copy. And let me say this, Krista, thank you to you and Monique for sending me a copy of your beautifully packaged book that I will be reading and look forward to reading. So thank you for that. I just wanted to say that.
Absolutely. And thanks, Kevin, for doing this with me. I appreciate it. And
no problem.
So I think with that, we'll just say goodnight. Have a good week, everyone. God bless. And we will see you in 2 weeks.
There's nothing